Okay, so now we're going to move on to our second speaker and on to another country. So Jim Stanford is a Canadian economist and the founder of the Progressive Economics Forum. Jim is the founding director of the Centre for the Future of Work, which is an independent, nonpartisan research organisation funded by the Australia Institute. Jim specialises in really breaking down complex economic chatter, so much so that working people like you and I can understand it, which is great. Jim is going to debunk some of the myths for us around some of the economic arguments you may have heard recently. Thanks for joining us, Jim. We really appreciate it. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura and Brett and your whole team. It's a privilege to work with such a fine, strong union. And I do want to start by offering my personal thanks to all of your members and their colleagues who've sacrificed so much, risking their health and their lives, frankly, to help Australia through this pandemic. It's incredible courage that your members have shown and pride in their profession and their work, and the fact that you keep doing it with that spirit, despite getting slapped in the face by the government yesterday with this very offensive measure, is just testimony to your professionalism. So thank you for what you do. Like I told ABC TV yesterday when they called about the wage freeze, I said, this is not just a morally offensive action, it's an economically self-destructive action. And it's not just nurses and other public servants who will be hurt by the wage freeze. It's actually the overall labor market and the whole economic recovery that Australia has to go through. I'm going to just show a couple of slides here so that I can summarize the main points of the argument. And hopefully you're seeing a title slide. Laura, can you just give me the thumbs up if you see that okay? Very good, excellent. Making the same mistake. Unfortunately, New South Wales has been a laboratory for this sort of self-destructive policy. Many of your members will remember it's 9 years ago now that the New South Wales government was the first government in Australia to impose a firm wage cap at the 2.5% rate. And they claimed at the time it was because of a deficit emergency and it was a shared sacrifice and blah, 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 blah. Exactly the same arguments we're hearing now. 9 years later, that wage cap is still in place and it became the new normal. And that's exactly what we will face if we allow them to get away with this wage freeze. Let me direct you, first of all, to our website at the Centre for Future Work. All of our research is available there for free, futurework.org.au. There's my Twitter handle and our center's Twitter handle. You're free to send out tweets from the presentation here. And then that link, that URL at the bottom of the slide that you see, is a link that takes you directly to a paper that we've just published on the self-defeating consequences of pay freezes, showing why it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for the budget, it doesn't make sense for the economy, and it certainly doesn't make sense for public servants. And I will circulate that link on the chat function as soon as this presentation is done, but I encourage you to look there for more information on our arguments. The dangers of this moment are going to be shared not just by people who work in the public service and those who are putting their lives on the line to help us fight this pandemic. The dangers will spill over into the overall economy. They are going to impose long-run economic losses on all public servants who are affected, including nurses. It is not a short-run temporary measure. Even if the wage freeze just lasts 1 year, I will show you the costs from that wage freeze continue to add up for the rest of your career, and in fact, for the rest of your lives. They will reduce consumer spending in the economy at the exact moment that we need more spending, not less. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect, because the New South Wales government is the biggest employer, not just in New South Wales, but in Australia, over 400,000 employees. This sets a very transparent benchmark that other employers are going to follow. And that will reduce wage increases throughout the economy, not just in the public sector, and enhances the risk that prices in the overall economy will start falling. They're already falling, and this is going to make it worse. And that would transform a recession into a depression. We're already in a recession. We don't want a depression, but a freezing or cutting wages and decreasing prices will do that exactly. The most self-inflicted wound from this measure will actually reduce the government's own tax revenue because, of course, nurses and other public servants pay taxes. So 30 cents or more of every dollar that you lose from the wage freeze is also lost to the government in reduced tax revenue. And then as it spreads through the economy, the government can actually end up with less revenue at the end of the day and a worse bottom line. This is a key point here that I think is often misunderstood. When the Premier stands up and says it's just a one-year wage freeze, we'll get back to normal wage increases in a year, it's just a temporary measure. People do not understand the basic maths of the question and how a one-year freeze permanently reduces the trajectory of a worker's income over the rest of their career. So the dotted line shows what would happen to a typical worker's weekly salary as wages are increased at 2.5% every year. Just a one-year freeze in this graph, it happens in year 2, and you see that the wage is frozen for 1 year. And then let's assume that they start growing again after, at again the 2.5% rate. Now, first of all, we can't assume that they'll go back to 2.5%. They said the 2.5% cap was a temporary measure, and 9 years later, we've still got it. So we can't assume that everything will get back to normal next year. The wage freeze could become the new normal, because I can assure you, next year the government is still going to be claiming poverty. Even if the wage increases come back in starting next year, you see how your future wage trajectory is permanently lower, and the losses add up year after year after year. And this is a basic point that both your members and the community as a whole have to understand. The cost that is being imposed on public sector workers who have risked their lives in this pandemic, it's not just a 1 year, forego a raise. It's tens of thousands of dollars over the rest of their career. If there isn't an increase, a catch-up increase in wages next year, if they don't give you a 5% wage increase next year, which seems highly unlikely to make up for the 2.5% you lost this year, your future wages will be 2.5% lower every year until you retire, because the future wage increases are applied to a smaller base. What's more, your superannuation contributions will be smaller, and the investment income that's earned on your superannuation account will also be smaller. Let's add up some of those numbers. This is from the paper that I mentioned at the beginning. We did scenarios of 4 potential wage freeze scenarios, and unfortunately, the one that we were projecting in New South Wales actually came to be yesterday. So the average salary, we'll focus on the New South Wales column there. The average salary for a public servant in New South Wales is $80,000 a year. Some nurses make more than that, some make less. The wage freeze will be imposed for 1 year. We hope, we don't know, that we'll get those wage increases later on, giving up 2.5%. That costs the typical New South Wales public sector worker $2,000 this year. But if they have, say, 20 years left in their career, let's say that worker is in their mid-40s, well, they're going to lose $54,000 between now and the time they retire. Their superannuation balance will be $10,000 smaller when they retire, and their pension income from that super balance will be $700 a year lower. So literally, you're going to be paying for this wage freeze until the day you die. And people do not understand how substantial and long-lasting the costs of even a temporary wage freeze would be. Let's say next year they come back and say, sorry, we're still in deficit and you have to have another wage freeze, then the costs amplify further. It's not just nurses who are going to be hurt, it's the overall economy. What happens when the largest employer in the land does something like this? It immediately spills over into the rest of the labor market. And this is the argument that your delegates, Brett, are going to have to take to the community, because we can't just go to the community and say, we're going to be hurt by this. We have to go to the community and say, everyone's going to be hurt by this, and it's going to be self-defeating in terms of trying to get our economy back on its feet. First of all, the public sector itself makes up about 17% of total employment. So if you freeze 17% of everyone's pay, that pulls down the average marker considerably. Secondly, and very dangerously, there's a demonstration effect. Private sector employers look at what the government is doing, and then they go straight to their workers and say, sorry, we can't afford any wage increases either. The government's doing it, so it must be the right thing to do. You get 0% as well. Then there's what we call a macroeconomic effect, because public sector workers and others who experience a wage freeze have less money in their pocket to spend. That means consumer spending falls. That means all of those businesses that are struggling to try and get back on their feet have even less business, less revenue, less sales, less profits, and they will reduce the wage increases that they offer to their employees. We have seen this movie before. As the great Yogi Berra says, it's like deja vu all over again. This is exactly what happened with the New South Wales wage cap, which was imposed 9 years ago, 2011-2012 fiscal year. The government claimed poverty. They imposed the 2.5% cap. That's where the red line is shown there after the GFC. They said it was temporary. In fact, became permanent. The blue line shows the rate of wage increase in the entire labor market, not just public sector workers, the entire labor market. Look what happened within months of imposing the 2.5% cap on the public sector. Wages started falling through the floor for the overall labor market, including the private sector, and they still haven't recovered. And now the state government wants to take that blue line right down to zero. And this will be a disaster, particularly because other employers are going to mimic that decision. So I strongly encourage you, with both moral arguments and economic arguments, to stand up against this measure. It's unfair, it's disrespectful for the sacrifices that you and your members have made, and it will hurt the economy, not help it. We can't let them get away with it. So thank you for what you do in your jobs, and thank you for your campaign against this wage freeze, and best of luck with it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jim. You definitely paint a very different picture to what so many of our current government officials are. So very insightful, definitely for our frontline workers here today.